Hello and welcome to Unit 4. So in this unit, we're going to be talking about the period following the French Revolution. So we'll start in the first chapter with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Um, Napoleon ended the revolution while keeping some of its important innovations, but then he started to kind of move away from that. Many people, saw him as a monster that was hungry for domination. He called himself First Consul, which was a term taken from the ancient Roman Republic. And within a year after he took over the French Republic, he had ended the revolution and began making France basically an authoritarian state. He worked to consolidate his power. He compromised with more conservative elements in society, like the Catholic Church and the exiled aristocrats, to get their support. His most important contribution, his most important legacy, would be the civil code that he enacted. And it had some elements of the Enlightenment and the Revolution with some more traditional principles like the powers of fathers over their children, husbands over their wives, employers over their workers, etc. And then he set out basically to conquer Europe with his grand army. He unified the French armies into one, and they were very, very loyal to him. And he was a very good strategist for the most part. And he attempted to colonize either under direct rule or as satellite kingdoms much of Europe. So he instituted in these places and the annexed territories he ruled from France, and the satellite kingdoms he put in, like Spain, and he put his brother in charge of Spain. So he included things like the abolition of serfdom, introduction of the Napoleonic Code, subordination of church to state, those sort of things. And it got to the point where really the only power that stood between Napoleon and total dominance of Europe was Great Britain. And he knew this. So he instituted a continental system which prohibited trade between Great Britain and France, or Great Britain and any one of France's dependent states and allies. What he did in Spain and Portugal had a significant effect over here in the Americas as well. So he put Spain under the rule of his brother Joseph, which created some juntas ruling in the name of Ferdinand in the Americas, which then eventually led to wars for independence. In Portugal, the court just got up. They just moved the entire court to Brazil with the help and protection of the British, and made their capital Rio de Janeiro for a while, and then kind of promoted Brazil to be, an empire, a nation inside of their empire, which eventually led to a peaceful independence for Brazil. You probably already know he made one crucial military mistake, which was, trying to fight two fronts at the same time and invading Russia in the fall. And of course, everybody knows that Hitler tried the same thing. But anyway, so the combined forces in Europe defeated him in October of 1813. He went into exile on the island of Elba, but he escaped with the help of many of his former soldiers and other people. And his period of independence lasted 100 days, and then he was defeated again at Waterloo in June of 1815. And this time they sent him really far away, and then he died of natural causes. But so then that brought about a restoration of Europe, and they were very traumatized, of course, by what had happened. So the Congress of Vienna met in 1814, 1815, settled the boundaries of European states, determined who would rule each nation, established a framework for international relations based on periodic meetings or congresses. Okay, the goal was post-war stability. And they tried to do this by establishing stable states with guaranteed borders. Um, and they looked to restore power to the people pre, pre-Napoleon as much as possible. This period also saw an emergence of conservatism as a backlash, from many of the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. Okay, though there were challenges in both ways to that. Okay, like I said, there were political revolts in the 1820s in Spain, in Spanish America, also in the Ottoman Empire. So just because the French Revolution was over doesn't mean that everything was calm. In fact, much of the 19th century we see revolutions. And then in the 1830s, again, this time in Western Europe, in Belgium, and in Poland, and in Naples. Okay, so there was still a lot of unrest. Okay, the next chapter deals with industrialization. I think the title is Industrialization and Social Ferment, which means, yeah, right, they're not over yet. Okay, but let's talk about the Industrial Revolution first, because it was a really important change that created the modern world. We're the pre-modern world now. We're going to be, or early modern world, but the Industrial Revolution brings about the world that will look more familiar to us. The roots of industrialization were in England with the textile manufacturing, but with uh, better machinery in the factories, and also steam-driven engines, and that led to then railroads to transport all of the raw materials and then the finished goods. So it just all of us worked together to spur industrial development and state power. And it made Britain the world leader in manufacturing. Um, it did eventually spread to the continent, first to Belgium and then to Prussia and Bohemia. And then the second industrial revolution, which we kind of we noticed, but not as much, was actually more in Germany and the United States. But by 1830, more than 1 million people depended on the cotton industry for employment. Cotton cloth was 50% of Britain's exports. That was in just a relatively, 30, 40 years, less than 50 probably. Okay. The factory owners grew very wealthy. There was an expansion of the middle class, as well as the working class. So the middle class, merchants, maybe small factory owners, but these are people that they're not the elite. They're not the traditional, knights or lords or barons or all those other people. These are just people that kind of made money. So the newly wealthy, but also the newly working class. People moved from the rural areas to the cities. So we had a huge growth in the towns and cities. Um, Workers were treated badly. It was not until the 1830s that the British government started to make inquiries focusing on women and children. And the living conditions were also horrible. They were overcrowded, poor sanitation, rampant disease and epidemics. Is it so many people moved into these cities, and the cities were not equipped to handle them. Um, and there were still people, of course, in farming, but the rising populations increased the demand for food. Okay. Um, Also, this is a period of time when we get to look at the isms, right? So you can nationalism is one that will last for a long time. It became eventually over time the most important of the isms. But nationalism, the idea that people derive their identities from their nations, and this is defined by common language, shared cultural traditions, sometimes religion, and we start to see that as these elements started to go, people started to identify this way. Um, Something like the Austrian Empire, which had Germans and Magyars from Hungary, and the Slavs, the Poles, the Czechs, the Croats, the Serbs, all those people. They're like, well, we don't belong with those other people. They're starting to really demonstrate this nationalism. We start to see liberalism, which we saw with the Enlightenment, but and so liberalism in economics and politics, though more does trace back to John Locke, but and opposed conservatives and revolutionaries. It was kind of in the middle there. But we also see socialism in the early labor movement, and that came out of that those poor working conditions. And it was 1848 that Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto. So this is the period when those things are, and I think that was for the second international meeting of the communists. So it'd been going on throughout this whole period. In 1848, in addition to that, we had more revolutions. There were food shortages, overpopulation, employment was an issue. I started to see some crop failures, like the potato famine in Ireland, that sort of thing. And so people are unhappy. There was yet another French Revolution. It was started in Paris, and it was all about reform that turned violent. The working class or the lower classes worried that, there's a lot of activism in the lower classes, and that worried the middle class and the conservatives. So they voted in a conservative National Assembly that adopted a new constitution. And it did call for a presidential election in which all adult males could vote. And they elected Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Who was, I think, the nephew of the other Bonaparte. Okay. We also start to see things happening in Italy and in Germany. Now, remember, these were not united yet, but we start to see activity in them. So there was a nationalist revolution in Italy, started in Sicily, moved up to places like Milan and Venice, and eventually Bonaparte intervened, put down all of these for now, but it will come back. But we also see things in German unification, which they don't quite achieve yet, but it's starting to work on it. Okay, and it became in Germany. It was the most important goals that they had. So anyway, that's the topics for this unit. I think it's a fun unit. I hope you enjoy it, and if you have any questions, of course, ask me.